Yeah, so as Kai alluded to, I teach pretty broadly in the areas of East Asian history and Asian studies. So I teach courses that focus on Japan, on China, courses that are more transnational. So when I was invited to give this talk, and that was an invitation that I enthusiastically accepted, I chose this title that's a little broad, Transpacific Perspectives on American Democracy. Ultimately, I decided that I am going to focus really on a century and more of Chinese commentary on American democracy and American social life. So I'm going to interweave a little bit of history because that is my disciplinary specialization, and also probably introduce you to a couple of significant Chinese thinkers. You know, when I teach Chinese history at Augustana, a big thing that I wish to impress upon my students is that Chinese history is very long. George Washington was a contemporary of the Qianlong Emperor. They died in the same year, 1799. But while George Washington was the first president of the United States of America, of course, Qianlong was the sixth emperor of his dynasty, and that dynasty, the Qing, was but one of many dynasties to rule over China in an imperial period that spanned 2,000 years. The entire history of the United States of America is shorter than the history of the Qing dynasty. So I think it's safe to say when you are looking at history from more of a world historical perspective, America and American democracy is still in its infancy, and sometimes I am not so certain that it will graduate even to the toddler bed. So I think when students learn about China and Chinese history, they should come away with a little bit of humility because this country has not been around that long compared to the vast scale of human history. So George Washington and the Qianlong Emperor, they lived at a time of growing global interconnectedness, including global trade between the Americas and China, as evidenced by this remarkable piece of 19th century export porcelain, hand-painted and handcrafted in China for the American market. Well-to-do Americans, including George Washington himself, enthusiastically consumed luxury Chinese goods like porcelain and also silk. But in the 19th century, the balance of trade between China and the West shifted as Chinese consumers got hooked on British opium grown in India. And China, which was once admired by the likes of Voltaire as a country of meritocracy and religious tolerance, fell into disarray by the turn of the 20th century. The Qing dynasty was fatally weakened at that time by imperialist incursions and internal revolt. An important Chinese thinker of this age, so we're looking at the very early years of the 20th century, is Liang Qichao, a reformer and modernizer. He was deeply critical of Chinese traditions, but unlike some of his contemporaries, like Sun Yat-sen, he was no revolutionary. He favored reform under the auspices of a monarchical system. In 1903, which is apparently the year this library was founded, he spent 5 months in the US, and afterwards he published an account of his trip. Liang Qichao was very impressed by many things in America. He talked very highly of New York's Central Park, for instance. He spoke favorably of American civic mindedness and many other aspects of American society. At the same time, he incisively critiqued the US wealth gap and the inhumanity and lawlessness of lynching. But Liang Qichao always saved his most biting criticisms for the people of China, including the overseas Chinese he encountered in America's Chinatowns. Some of his points about Chinese people compared to Westerners were lofty generalizations, such as, we have a village mentality, not a national mentality. Other critiques were more mundane, even humorous. Westerners, he wrote, walk together like a formation of geese. Chinese are like scattered ducks. In the context of China's profound weakness on the global stage, Chinese intellectuals like Liang Qichao engaged in a process of relentless self-critique and sometimes internalized a sense of inferiority. You can even say it's internalized racism. Given what he saw as the flawed Chinese character, Liang wrote, if we were to adopt a democratic system of government now, it would be nothing less than committing national suicide. Freedom, constitutionalism, and republicanism would be like hempen clothes in winter or furs in summer. It is not that they are not beautiful, they are just not suitable for us. According to Liang, the Chinese people of today can only be governed autocratically. They cannot enjoy freedom. Now, this was an intentionally provocative claim that he was making, and in other writings, he took more complicated positions. He was not just a social critic, he was also deeply versed in Chinese history and philosophy. Based on his study of Chinese antiquity, he even argued in other publications that China had practiced a form of democracy in ancient times. Here, it's useful to make a point regarding what we're talking about when we talk about democracy in China or in Chinese, because the translation of such significant terms is not always a straightforward matter. Now, the Chinese word for democracy is minju, and it's a compound of two characters that mean people and rule. This is actually much the same as our Greek-derived term, democracy. But minju was a neologism adopted in China in the 19th century to give a name to the concept of rule by the people, be it direct or representative. But this new Chinese term and this new concept to describe a certain type of government of elected representatives always existed in China and in Chinese alongside other older conceptions about the relationship between the people and rulership. The term minju can carry connotations of rule for the people. Indeed, Liang Qichao argued that the king ruled for the people in ancient China. The will of the people held priority over the king's selfish interests and those of his powerful advisors. He thus claimed, although there was not the name of representative government, there was yet the fact of it. He argued, in other words, that the king in China represented the will of the people and ruled for the good of the people. And herein lies a core message of many Chinese critiques of American-style democracy, from Liang Qichao's time to the present. Democracy does not always work for the people, even if leaders are elected by the people. So let me give a few other examples of shifting Chinese perspectives on democracy. And in doing so, I will continue my whirlwind tour through the history of modern China. As a monarchist, Liang Qichao did not get his way. The dynasty was overturned in 1911 by a Republican revolution. But even though there was this Republican revolution, China after 1911 remained deeply divided. Its territory was carved up into these warlord enclaves, and its Republican institutions were very weak. Elections were held in the 1910s, but some observers of the elections were very much not impressed. So I'm going to introduce this local official and Confucian scholar named Liu Daopeng And I'm very much drawing on an excellent book by the historian Henrietta Harrison, who used Liu's diaries to write the story of one man's life in a northern China, a North China village. To Liu Dapeng, elections were, as he observed them, a farce of vote buying and empty displays. He expressed his disdain for candidates for office, as a good Confucian scholar would, in a poem, and here is one stanza. Candidates don't know about current affairs and have no sense of shame. They just wag their tails and beg to become assembly members. They beseech the onlookers to do their best to speak for them, and every day at their offices they set forth fine banquets. Liu's critique went beyond the problem of money in politics. He argued that elected officials were simply poorly equipped to serve the people. They don't know about current affairs, for instance. To Liu, the self-interest of the candidates and their lack of credentials should disqualify them from holding office. He wrote in his diary, "If you create a people's state, but you go against the people's wishes, then you lose the point of it being a people's state." Serving the people was also the objective of Mao Zedong, the communist leader who took power in China upon the founding of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, in 1949. So here we see Chairman Mao in a 1960s era propaganda poster. And his other image shows the entrance to this political compound in Beijing called Zhongnanhai, where there are some political offices and even residences of high-ranking officials. And the calligraphy in gold is the slogan, "Serve the people," in Mao's own hand. Mao, too, believed in a form of democracy, but his version of democracy, the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat, was premised on a definition of the people that excluded certain groups. He called for, quote, democracy for the people and dictatorship over the reactionaries. And the reactionaries included such folk as the landlord class and the bureaucratic capitalist class. In Mao's vision of democracy, we find the gist of the problem with non-democratic forms of government for the people. It's the problem of who gets to define the people, who gets to identify the people's needs. And when some people are treated as non-people, how can this result in anything but violence? The end of the Mao era in 1976, when he died, gave rise to a very different leader who would open China to trade, to foreign investment, and to market reforms. Deng Xiaoping famously said, "Black cat, white cat, if it catches mice, it's a good cat," as this political cartoon illustrates. So in other words, a country can be capitalist or communist. It could be governed by elected representatives or guided by a single party state. The important thing is not the means. The important thing for Deng Xiaoping was the ends. And what mattered to him was a sovereign, strong, and prosperous nation. And whatever means would get you there, go for it. Others disagreed in China. Some argued that the means and the ends are inseparable. In 1978, at a time when Deng Xiaoping was promoting 4 modernizations, where China needed to modernize agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology, an activist named Wei Jingsheng called for a 5th modernization, democracy. According to Wei, democracy is not merely an inevitable stage of development. Democracy is also the very condition that allows such development to reach beyond this stage. Without this condition, without democracy, society will become stagnant and economic growth will face insurmountable obstacles. For voicing such sentiments, Wei was arrested, and he spent over a dozen years in prison before his release was negotiated by the Clinton administration. He lives in the US in exile to this day. But here's the thing, Wei Jingsheng was wrong. He may have been right about the inherent value of democracy, I think he was, but he and many others were wrong to suppose that China had to democratize in order to further modernize and avoid economic stagnation. Quite the contrary, the decades after Wei's arrest proved to the world that a single-party state could indeed guide a country through remarkable economic growth, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China is no longer the weak and divided country of Liang Qichao's day, and this changed context has resulted in new, more confident critiques of American democracy. So let me just note here that in the late 1970s, some of the criticisms of the government and some of the calls for democracy were actually posted in public spaces. So there was a place in Beijing called Democracy Wall. And so Wei Jingsheng's essay on the fifth modernization and some of his other writings were actually written on these papers that were publicly posted. So that is what that slide is showing. But I want to turn now to a contemporary critic of US democracy by the name of Wang Huning, an influential scholar and political thinker with an academic background in political science. He is now the chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and a top member of the Politburo Standing Committee. This places him in a rarefied echelon of political power in China. In the 1980s, a little over 150 years after DeTocqueville toured the United States, and 85 years after Liang Qichao's visit, Wang Huning spent 6 months traveling in the US at the invitation of the American Political Science Association. For half that trip, he was actually hosted by the University of Iowa. And I'll just note here, this is Wang Huning with Xi Jinping, the current president of China. So this kind of indicates, how powerful and influential this scholar was. Right? This would be like if one of my colleagues in the political science department became vice president or something like that. But Xi Jinping was also in Iowa in the 1980s. So there's this really interesting connection to very powerful people in China and Iowa. So Wang spent 3 months in Iowa City, but his travels spanned the country, from New York to California, from the Coca-Cola headquarters in Atlanta to the Amana colonies. All the while, he was keeping a journal, speaking to Americans, including various academics, and reading then contemporary American cultural and political commentaries, such as The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom and the work of historian Samuel Huntington. Upon his return to China, he wrote and published the book America Against America. This book can be accessed in English translation online, and it's well worth your perusal. Wang's observations are keen and wide-ranging. He touched upon the sanctification of American football as a symbol of the American spirit, cars, computers, and credit cards, sexual mores, standardized tests, the legal status of pets, loneliness as a social phenomenon, corporate influence in politics and higher education, the US tax code, think tanks, though he preferred the term thought factories, and much more. His visit coincided with a presidential election year, George H.W. Bush versus Michael Dukakis. In a section of the book that has positive things to say about the functioning of American political life, Wang described the pageantry, traditions, and norms that surround the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, practically giving a play-by-play account of the Bush inauguration and Reagan's departure from the White House. He noted, "The cost of the entire event was staggering, which is a hallmark of the American system. However, as an established procedure for the transfer of power, the cost is not much compared to the chaos and even bloodshed that could occur with the transfer of power." So here and elsewhere, Wang wrote favorably of America and its norms and institutions, but his overall thesis was that America should not be naively admired, for it is a paradox. Thus the title, America Against America. It's a country of wealth and a country of shameful poverty. Its people are both pragmatic and prone to irrational futuristic ambitions. It is democratic and undemocratic, stable, but also riven by crises. Americans, Wang noted, could not even agree on their core values, with some exalting freedom, or more specifically, political liberty, while others called for equality. In Wang's analysis, America had progressed over time toward greater political liberties, but social and economic equality was stymied precisely because most Americans insisted on the primacy of freedom. Unstated but implied is the premise that China is the opposite, a country in which equality is valued above liberty. In his analysis of electoral politics, Wang had much to say about the influence of money in elections and the commercial logic of campaigns. Political parties do not choose candidates based on values, as he saw it, but rather for their commodity appeal. The voter's role is simply to go shopping among the commodities available in the market. The entire process, to Wang, is more centralized than participatory, and due to the costs of campaigning, ordinary people don't really choose party candidates and thus have limited say over who ultimately gets elected. Now, I'll leave it to colleagues in political science to rebut Wang's claims about how American democracy works. His arguments certainly do have their weaknesses. As a historian, what interests me is the development of these certain Chinese perspectives on democracy over time, and particularly a comparison between these two thinkers, Liang Qichao and Wang Huning, who toured and wrote about America at moments of profound change in their home countries. So in 1903, at a time of imperialist incursions and dynastic collapse, Liang Qichao looked at America and he concluded, republicanism and freedom and democracy, these may be fine things, but they are not for the people of China because the people of China are too flawed. In the 1980s, by contrast, with China stabilized and with an economic miracle on the horizon, Wang Huning said, American democracy is not for the people of China because American democracy is inherently flawed. This shift captures something important about a changed national self-conception on the part of Chinese thinkers over the past century. But one must know that for all the differences of context and emphasis, Liang Qichao and Wang Huning reached an identical conclusion. There is an American way and a Chinese way, and the American way, the American political system, should not be emulated by China. But the two agreed on some other things as well. And I want to extend my comparison of the two in a little bit of a different direction, noting that having traveled in America 85 years apart, they both thought the library was awesome. So here I'll make a comparison that's particularly apt for our venue today. Both Liang Qichao and Wang Huning extolled the riches and the openness of these magnificent institutions. Liang Qichao wrote about being amazed that students at the University of Chicago could browse the stacks on their own. So I found a picture of the stacks at the University of Chicago Library. They didn't need to request books from librarians. The fact that only a small number of books were stolen each year was evidence of what Liang Qichao saw as the general level of public morality in this country. Once again, Liang found the Chinese lacking in comparison, implying that open stacks would lead to a rather large number of stolen books in his home country. As for Wang Huning, he lavished praise on both university and public libraries. The library system, he wrote, manages a vast and interconnected knowledge reservoir. Libraries collected, maintained, and circulated materials for the benefit of readers, for the management of society, and even for future needs that are not yet known. Maximum openness, he wrote, is a prerequisite for the library to be most effective. Without this condition, the reservoir of knowledge will become like a pool of stagnant water. He visited university libraries at Harvard, MIT, Berkeley, Yale, Princeton, the University of Michigan, but he wrote most extensively about the Iowa City Public Library. And while he may not have made it to Rock Island, I'm sure he would have found this library to be exceptional as well, which is why I also included it in my slide. The library in Iowa City, he wrote, is quite good, with a full complement of equipment that a large library would normally have. He cataloged such amenities as books, of course, including children's books, records, even movies, newspapers and periodicals, job advertisements, photocopiers, computers. Such a convenient library, he wrote, is free to the public. Anyone who lives in Iowa City can get a library card for free. When I read Wang's praise for the library, I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, because that's kind of his writing style. Right? What paradox, what contradiction would he expose? But there was none. He only had good things to say about American libraries. What he didn't say was this: the library is, of course, part and parcel of America's participatory democratic culture. A place where you can access information to better engage in public discourse. A place where you can register to vote, even if you are poor. A place where you can attend a lecture series about democracy and take part in the discussion. You know, my students, some of my students, they feel quite jaded about the state of American democracy. They intuit, one might even say they experience firsthand some of Wang Huning's critiques, and I do as well. I too am frustrated by party politics, the influence of big money in elections, special interest groups, the commoditized spectacle of campaigns, all of the text messages I'm constantly getting asking for my money and donations. And I also fear that some of our political norms, ones that Wang praised, like the peaceful transfer of power from one president to the next, are being eroded. But in the face of such concerns of possible cynicism, I find refuge in this place, the library, this reservoir of knowledge, this venue for conversations free to the public. No matter how far a country progresses economically, this, I believe, You don't get a library like this without a culture of democracy. And you don't get a culture of democracy without the institutions of democracy. I'd like to conclude with a quotation from one more Chinese thinker. Hu Shi was a prominent participant in the pro-democracy New Culture movement that swept China in the 1910s and 1920s. Whereas Liang Qichao and Wang Huning just spent a short time in the US, less than a year, Hu Shi spent a significant time in the US studying philosophy at Columbia's Teachers College with none other than John Dewey. Back in China, he became a critic of both Mao's communism and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist party politics. The latter was predicated on the idea that the Chinese people should have democracy someday, but not yet. In the short term, the thinking went, the Chinese people were unprepared for democracy and needed the guidance, the tutelage of a party state. Hu Shi countered, the only way to have a democracy is to have democracy. In other words, one cannot wait for a perfect stage of preparation or for a perfectly functioning system. People learn to exercise the rights and responsibilities of democratic citizenship in practice. People work toward the improvement of the system in practice, in the voting booth, in the classroom, in the library. And so here we are, let's discuss. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Lawrence?
Oh, I put the microphone right over there.
Thank you.
So what's the current, because you stopped in the 1980s, so what would be the current feelings about American democracy?
Yeah, so Wang Huning visited the U.S. in the 1980s, but he is, at that time, he was just a professor, assistant professor in political science at Fudan University in Shanghai. But now, he is really an architect of state political ideology in China. He's a powerful politician. So some of his views can be seen as current state-authorized views. And his political ideas have been described as neo-authoritarian, right? So the idea that China really needs a more centralized, non-democratic form of government to keep China as a stable country that will continue to experience economic growth, and also to avoid what continues to be seen as some of the flaws or the crises embedded in the American political system. Basically, the kind of polarization, the lack of a unified idea of cultural or political values. So that's Wang Huning. But what I would say certainly is that there is no single sort of Chinese perspective on American democracy. But his perspective is a powerfully influential one right now.
And this is another, I neglected to mention in your introduction, you grew up in Hawaii, in Colorado, and now you're here in this liminal space between Iowa and Illinois. Do you think someday you'll write a history about the different views of America you find in those places?
Yeah, so I did choose this broad title. Actually, I'm teaching my Japanese Empire course right now. And this is also gives an interesting perspective on East Asian views of American democracy at different times. Because after World War II, the U.S. occupied Japan for 6 years, really for twice as long as the U.S. and Japan were at war. The U.S. was occupying Japan. And at that time, Americans basically drafted the Constitution of Japan, granting Japanese citizens free speech at the same time that they were censoring speech within the context of occupation. So I'm very interested right now in connections between Asia and the US, right? This idea of the Transpacific, not just American, not just Asian, but the connections and the movements between the two. And in terms of, the Pacific, right? I was also talking to my students in connection to Japanese Empire about Pacific Islands that are a part of America, but that's not always widely understood. So Guam is an unincorporated territory of the U.S., but Guamian citizens cannot vote in the presidential election. So definitely expanding it to think of different Asian and Pacific regions can enrich this discussion.
In China, how do money power and political power interact?
Well, they certainly do. They're not free of those problems. So the Chinese Communist Party, its members are also businessmen oftentimes, right? So we think about, this is a communist party, they must be anti-capitalist. But no, the People's Liberation Army even is heavily engaged in different industries. So there is definitely the money in politics, if you will, but it's very different from the situation of money in our electoral politics, because politicians are not elected in China. But it is sometimes seen as a concern, even from the perspective of high-ranking Chinese officials. Corruption is always seen as something that can be destabilizing, right? So this idea that the country serves the people, even if the leaders aren't elected by the people, historically and today, there is something to that, right? Because what Chinese Communist Party officials are really worried about is often instability, right? And if you're really not serving the people, if the people are oppressed, eventually they will revolt, right? So corruption, including corruption with officials lining their own pockets, is a concern of politicians in China. There's back in the first year of the Beijing Olympics, in 2008, there was a major earthquake in Sichuan province, and a lot of schools collapsed. And the schools specifically collapsed because of corrupt officials skimming money out of public works projects. So the government doesn't want to see things like that happen. But of course, the money and politics are intertwined there as well, in different ways.
I'm wondering what the philosophers you mentioned had to say about American slavery.
Mm-hmm.
About Hoosier specifically, or
Any of them.
Any of them? Yeah. Well, so Liang Qichao, as I mentioned, talked about lynching. He, let me just say that he also, in the same piece of writing, expressed some anti-Black racism. And at the same time, he said, this doesn't make sense, right? This is lawless and it's cruel. And it's strange for a country that is so principled in other ways to have a practice like this. At that time, at the turn of the 20th century, a lot of thinkers in China were also heavily influenced by social Darwinism, right? The idea that different societies would inevitably compete, and social Darwinism was also tied to racism. So this was a time when something like Uncle Tom's Cabin was being translated into Chinese. And so people in China were thinking about things like the history of slavery in the U.S. But when they looked at the history of slavery in the U.S., they tended to tie it to what was going on in China at the time, and would basically say things like, we are going to become slaves because we are being colonized. And so that's why it's interesting to look at literature about slavery in America, because they saw something similar in their conditions as a not fully free people under semi-colonialism.
What is the relationship between the military and the powers in China, and particularly after the Civil War with Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong? How did the Chinese were able to control the spread of weapons on the population and so forth, and the status of the right to bear arms in China?
Yeah. So, as is the case in Japan and probably other Asian countries, there really is no right to bear firearms. Right? Private use of firearms is very rare, not only in China, which is non-democratic, but also in Japan. In terms of the military, the People's Liberation Army what was the military of the Chinese Communist Party during the Civil War, and the PLA remains today the military of China. There's a lot of investment in the military. At some points in the Mao period, you did have, right, so the poster from the Cultural Revolution of Mao. That was a time of great political turbulence, where you had these teenagers, really young people, who were so devoted to Mao, rising up to make revolution on their own. And so sometimes they would, incarcerate people or violently struggle against political enemies, perceived political enemies, and in some cases did get their hands on weapons. And actually the People's Liberation Army had to come in and try to quell some of that almost popular violence. But generally speaking, yeah, the army does have a kind of monopoly on the tools of violence in China. Though that's not the case for all time. I think it's safe to say that's the case in the present. Which is why when you do see acts of violence in China, when you hear about acts of violence in China, it's more likely that you're going to hear about something like a stabbing or a car ramming into a person or something like that.
We did want to leave time for, oh, I'm sorry, please. And then we're going to have time for refreshments and open conversations.
So I've been to Japan, and I loved that guns were outlawed. I felt so safe. But I'm curious as to how did they get to that?
Well, in Japan, actually, Japan had a very very much a warrior culture. And a kind of feudal society in its medieval period, right, with different samurai lords fighting each other for territory. And really it was the establishment of the last shogunate. So in China you have these dynastic families. In Japan you have these dynastic military families, and that's called the shogunate. So after a period of very divided territory and fighting against different lords called the warring states, one samurai lord kind of reunified the country to establish the Tokugawa shogunate. And in that process, even back then, we're talking 1600, the general populace was disarmed. Right? So only samurai could have the samurai sword. And other than kind of implements necessary for agriculture, the general populace was not supposed to have any weapons. So, if you think about this in terms of a right to bear arms sense, this was intended to maintain political power and to avoid rebellion. So there's actually, that sort of long history in Japan behind the idea that the population shouldn't be armed. Interestingly, there are indigenous peoples in Japan that are not of the Japanese ethnicity. So the most northernmost island of Hokkaido was home to a people called the Ainu. And Japan's very restrictive gun policies can actually be problematic for groups like that traditionally hunted for a livelihood. So yeah, these are complex issues.
Before we go any further, would you please join me in thanking Dr. Liza Lawrence?